you to our speaker and the creative mind behind the exhibition of Salvador Dali's work entitled Stairway to Heaven. And our speaker is David Rubin.
Good evening. Thank you so much for inviting me to join you. And I'm going to now put up my PowerPoint. So every exhibition tells a story, and Salvador Dali's Stairway to Heaven tells the story of two book illustration projects that Dali did, of the many that he did throughout his prolific career. He actually did over 100 book illustrations, but these are two of the most significant. And so let's start by talking a little bit about the artist himself. Dali was born in Catalonia, in the upper northeast tip of Spain that you see right here, known as the Plains of Empordà. He really rose to significant fame in the late 1920s when he became a member of the second wave, really, of the Surrealist group, which was based in Paris. Surrealism was founded by this guy, Andre Breton, in the early 1920s, and the first group of the Surrealists were mostly abstract artists who practiced what's known as automatism, which is painting very freely, very spontaneously, without any idea in mind, so that you tap the unconscious. Dali, along with painters such as Yves Tanguy, who you see over here, they were painting images that were more realist in appearance, but in fact, the imagery was very incongruous. It also had to do with the unconscious and with the world of dreams. In this group photo, you see also the artists Jean Art, Man Ray, Max Ernst, and then several poets, Tristan Tzara, Paul Eluard, and René Prével. And of course, here's Dali right at the center. So this is the kind of painting that Dali was doing in 1929 when he became embraced and supported by Andre Breton and the other Surrealists. Dali painted using a method that he invented, which he called the Paranoiac critical method. By that, he wanted to come up with images that were irrational, often where they would look like apparitions, or something would look like more than one thing at the same time. The Paranoiac critical method involves self-inducing a state of trance or hallucination, which he did without the use of drugs. And then he would get into this trance-like state and somehow very freely create, even though it's representational, this very illogical imagery. Some of his very familiar images that I show you here will actually be significant when we look at the prints throughout this conversation. For example, here we see a rock infested with ants. And this, by the way, in this painting, The Great Masturbator, that's a self-portrait of Dali with his distinctive long nose and mustache. And you ask, why is he making a painting called The Great Masturbator? Well, he and the other Surrealists had a big interest in the psychological theories of Sigmund Freud, who explained everything in terms of repressed sexual desires. So sex did play a big part in his imagery, both in his paintings of the period, and as we'll see in one of the series we're going to look at tonight. A little more about Dali. I'm going to mention two books that he authored that are very significant in understanding how his life changed and how his views changed, and how this shift in his worldview is reflected in comparing the two bodies of work. First of all, we see him here in 1929 with Gala, not yet his wife, but soon to be. They married in 1934. She was, in fact, the wife of the poet Paul Eluard, who we saw in the previous image. But she divorced him in 1929 and began a relationship with Dali. But this was not your ordinary conventional relationship. As detailed in part in the somewhat fictionalized, but nevertheless, a lot of it is well documented, The Secret Life of Salvador Dali, his autobiography. Gala was a libertine. She was a sexually promiscuous woman, and together they would rent castles and palaces and throw these big sex orgies where they also rented androgynous men and women. And whereas Gala may have been a participant, Dali was actually more of a voyeur. He considered himself to be more of a spectator than a participant. And this had a lot to do with some insecurities and fears he had at this point in his life, dealing with sexuality, because when he was a young boy, his father showed him pictures of people with advanced venereal disease. So this kind of left an odd feeling in terms of his interpretation and worldview when it comes to all things sexual. Now, the other publication he authored in 1951, it's his mystical manifesto. And what happened in Dali's life, where he really changed his viewpoint, was in the 1940s, he rediscovered Catholicism. He became what we call a born-again Catholic. And he also considered himself a mystic. And he also tried to reconcile religion and science, because he was very interested in nuclear fission and the idea of things breaking down and dematerializing into atoms, molecules, etc. So in this painting from 1950, this is one of a couple of paintings where he portrayed his wife Gala as the Madonna. But you'll see that things are starting to break apart. That has to do with his ideas about nuclear fission and all things in the universe being interconnected in terms of a substructure. Oh, I should mention too, he referred to himself as an ex-surrealist in the Mystical Manifesto. And he basically, what his search was for mystical ecstasy and paradisiacal happiness on Earth. So he didn't necessarily negate the wild sex orgies that they had when he was younger, because they could be encompassed under the term ecstasy. Okay, so the first book illustration, the Chant de Maldoror, it was actually at the suggestion of Picasso that the publisher hired Dali, commissioned Dali to do the prints, which he worked on from 1932 to 34, and they were published in 34. The actual text is one that was really a favorite book for all the surrealists. It was written by the Comte de Lautremont, who lived from 1846 to 70. It was published in 1868 to 69. And basically it tells the story of a violent and perverse and very sadistic character, a despicable protagonist who has renounced God, humanity, and conventional morality. So throughout the text, it's not a real story in the sense that it's a non-linear story. It's more like poetry than prose, so that you don't sort of follow the protagonist in a chronological sequence in time. Rather, it kind of moves all over the place, but tells a lot of descriptive passages of sex, violence, cannibalism, and perverse sex acts. Now, the other book we're going to talk about, that for which Dali did illustrations, contrasts rather radically with the tone of the Chant de Maldoror, because it's indeed a very religious text about finding God, finding your way to heaven. It's, of course, Dante's The Divine Comedy, which is one of the greatest literary works of all time. And in The Divine Comedy, Dali basically travels first down into the depths of the earth to hell. And to get there, he has to basically descend through 9 circles into the earth. And his guide in this is the spirit of the ancient poet Virgil, who then, after they've made it through hell, they start ascending through purgatory, which is described as a mountain with 7 terraces around it. And they move upward from terrace to terrace. And then when they're getting ready for Dali to move on to paradise and ultimately reach his way to heaven, Virgil turns the task of guiding him over to Beatrice. Beatrice is actually the spirit of Beatrice. Beatrice is actually a woman who Dali knew when he was a child. She was an older woman. He felt great platonic love for her. So she, did I say Dali or Dante? Beatrice is a woman that Dante knew as a young child. It felt great platonic love for her. And she is the one who will guide him up the 10 spheres until they reach heaven. So so there is a chronology there. And so because of the contrast and the way these two pieces are written, we'll see in Dali's illustrations for the Chant de Maldoror, there's no specific narrative. It's more of an interpretation. And in the Divine Comedy, of course, he goes plate by plate through the stories. And when I was researching the project, you can actually find them all online. So I was able to really take a close look at each passage and then try to figure out what Dali was responding to in Dante's text. But what we'll see as we go through both bodies of work is that there's actually as much of Salvador Dali in terms of what we see in the illustrations as there is in what came out of the text that he was illustrating. The works are in fact incredibly autobiographical. And so we'll start with the Chant de Maldoror, which was published in 1934. As I mentioned, it was Picasso who suggested that Dali take on this commission, which he was very happy to do. We'll see as we go through the prints, and I'm not going to show them all, but I picked out several that I think beautifully illuminate what Dali's achievement was, is that he had a personal lexicon of symbols that recur throughout. We'll find that he also relied a great deal, that there's a lot of crossover and overlap with his own art at the time. I'll show you by comparison some of the paintings that he was working on during the same period that he worked on the Chant de Maldoror. So some of them may have in fact been studies where he was testing out his ideas. And then finally, we'll see that his Freudian insecurities that I mentioned are front and center in many of the illustrations for the Chant de Maldoror. So he begins in the very first plate by paying homage to Gala, the sexually promiscuous libertine. Here you see the two of them in a photograph from 1933 on the right. And he also introduces some of the iconographic elements that will recur throughout. You notice she's holding in her hand something you may not be able to make out right away, but it's basically a lamb chop and a fork and a spoon, eating utensils. So basically he's picking up on the metaphor. He's using these objects metaphorically to pick up on the idea that there's a lot of cannibalistic references, and sex and cannibalism are more or less equated in the text of the Chant de Maldoror. So the lamb chop represents human flesh and bones, and of course, the eating utensils represents what you use to eat that. Now, the setting also has a strong biographical reference, and we'll see this setting not only in the Chant de Maldoror, but also in some of the plates from the Divine Comedy. And this is, of course, his beloved area where he grew up, the flat plains of Empordà in Spain. And typically he uses a very deep perspective, single point perspective, and he exaggerates it with these horizontal lines that extend all the way to the foreground of the image. And in the far distance are the mountains. And I show you a picture of the region on the right there, so you can see what he was articulating. In plate 3, Gala appears once again, and now we can see some of the paintings that he was working on simultaneously. This portrait of Gala from 1933 was probably done at the same time he was figuring out what he was going to do in this print. He calls it Portrait of Gala with two lamb chops, so there you have symbols from his lexicon that do appear in the print and throughout the series. Now, I've shown you a detail here of this tiny little section in the print where you can see it's a little fuzzy, but here is an adult male holding the hand of a young child. And this is an image that will recur throughout the Chant de Maldoror. This is presumed to be, well, the child is Dali, we know that, and the man is presumed to be his father, the one, of course, the man, of course, who showed him the photographs of people with venereal disease when he was a young child. Here you see them appear in a detail from his painting Atavistic Vestiges After the Rain from 1934, again, the same year that he was working on the Chant de Maldoror. Now here we see a typical surrealist image that's very incongruous. Two paintings, again, painted simultaneously with the production of the prints for Chant de Maldoror. In this one, we see a piano that seems to have transformed into a skull. And I think next to that, yeah, the skull is chewing on a nightstand, which is a reference we see in some of the prints to Dali's nightstand from his childhood bedroom. And this one, a skull is devouring the piano. So he doesn't replicate either one exactly, although this part without the nightstand does reappear in the print. Here's the skull, the piano as a body, but instead of munching on the nightstand, it's munching on the leg of the adult man with the young child. So presumably, again, Dali and his father appear in the print. Okay. Another image that we see quite frequently throughout the Chantimal d'Aurore is this skeletal form. Because death is one of the themes in the Chantimal d'Aurore, Dali merely represents death often in the form of a skeleton, where the body has essentially decomposed, but what remains are bones. The head has been removed from this figure. At the base of the figure is a kind of a ring of lamb chops, bones from lamb chops. But we also see, for example, a phallic form and some soft forms. So another motif that recurs throughout are these references to the phallus in both states, soft and erect. The painting where he developed this figure initially, though, was painted before he started working on the Chantimal d'Aurore. It was an homage to Gala, a painting called Imperial Monument to the Child Woman. Now, Dali also was extremely literate in terms of his knowledge of art and art history. And we'll see many instances of that in the Divine Comedy illustrations. But there's one painting in particular that influenced a lot of the plates in the Chantimal d'Aurore. It was a painting from the mid-19th century by Jean-Francois Millet called the Angelus. And the traditional story of this painting is that these are two peasants, two workers in the field who collect potatoes and put them in a wheelbarrow. And in the far distance is a church. And the original story was that they're responding to the bell of the church tower, so they're taking a moment to pray. Now, when Dali came across a reproduction of this painting in 1929, he remembered that he had seen a reproduction of it when he was a child, and it made him very uneasy, and it made him anxious. And so, and then somehow he received a letter from someone proposing that perhaps Millet had painted out a coffin. And so Dali became very curious about this, and he managed to get the Louvre to x-ray the painting. And they discovered that in fact, Millet did paint out a coffin-like shape. So it seemed to substantiate Dali's thesis that that they were actually mourning the death of their child. And Dali also wrote a paper on this where he used his paranoiac critical method to analyze the painting, the Angelus. But anyway, we'll see that how this painting appears in a number of the prints. In fact, these are two figures based on the Angelus painting in Dali's 1934 painting, The Spectre of the Angelus, where he introduces this strange looking woman who appears in several of the Chantimal d'Aurore prints. She's got protruding buttocks, this very strange elliptical head. Notice there's a lamb chop on top of it, protruding breasts. So again, he's sort of working and developing in this painting some of the symbolism and some of the motifs that he'll use in the Chantimal d'Aurore. The crutch, by the way, for Dali is a symbol of both death and resurrection. We'll see the crutch supporting odd things like protruding buttocks in a number of these prints. And we'll also see the crutch appearing in the Divine Comedy. Now here you see the same figure. In this case, her head is more or less decomposed and just left this long bone. Here's a bone piercing another piece of flesh. Here's a bone piercing one of her breasts. Here's something that could either be splayed flesh or disemboweled innards, possibly. Bones at the bottom. So here, Dali is responding again to the idea that sex is equated with a decay and death, and thus when you die, your body decomposes, you're just left with bones. So that's again, his insecurities about sex, having seen pictures of people with VD seem to be informing his viewpoint of sexual women, and particularly in his illustrations for the Chantimal d'Aurore. This is one of the most, in my opinion, one of the most amazing prints and one of the most interesting prints from the Chant de Maldoror. And once again, there's a contemporaneous painting, The Spectre of Sex Appeal from 1934, where we see Dali now without his father, just the young child alone, witnessing this obviously libertine woman who is suffering for having engaged in sex acts. And so her breasts are bandaged and her arm is supported by the crutch. And her body is supported by the crutch over here. The young boy also appears here in the plate 11 of the Chant de Maldoror. And this time we see two women. This one here, she seems to have, where's my arrow? Here we are. She seems to have healthier breasts, but she's still supported by the crutch. She still has the protruding buttocks, posed in a similar pose, sort of mirror imagery. The woman with the bandaged breasts who's up here on the pedestal. Okay, moving forward. And then, yeah, here's another variation on that same image in plate 14, where the breasts are being held up by a crutch. Here you can see her elliptical head over here. It looks like there's another woman with breasts over here. A bone is piercing, puncturing the breast here, and another breast is being cut into by a knife. And of course, this long pole is both piercing a breast and a sort of piercing what could be disemboweled innard on this pedestal, which also is referred to as a dissecting table. That's one of the few references that actually come out of the text for the Chant de Maldoror, and I'll refer to that in another example. Here's Dali, the young boy, as witness at the lower left, but a figure that he introduces in this image, who also appears in two paintings of the time, is an image of his childhood nurse, who, rather than being the sexually advanced woman, she represents innocence. So he's contrasting innocence here. Of course, he represents innocence, she represents innocence, but on the dissecting table, we have the lurid remains of someone who's been actively sexual. One of Dali's most famous paintings, which you see on the right, which was painted before he worked on the Chant de Maldoror, is called The Persistence of Memory. It's from 1931. And of course, there are two significant, well, actually three significant symbolic images here. One is Dali's self-portrait with his long extended nose and eyelashes that we've seen elsewhere. But the flaccid clock, the kind of melting clock that's draped over the dissecting table and also draped over the limb of a tree, represented for Dali impotence as well as the malleability of time. And in his autobiography, he claimed that he was impotent, which is perhaps one reason he didn't want to participate in the orgies and rather chose to be just a voyeur. The ants that we saw on the rock in his earlier painting appear now on the clock here. In this particular plate from the Chant de Maldoror, we see a utensil and a lamb chop, a fork piercing an object that's a little hard to make out what that is exactly. Looks like splayed flesh draped over the dissecting table. And again, the big symbol of impotence for him here with the soft clock and the lamb chop in the middle of it and a knife piercing through it. Now here's an example where he basically abstracts and distorts the figures from Millet's The Angelus, turns them essentially into two skulls, associating them with death. Throughout the Chant de Maldoror, he either sexualizes them or shows them in relationship to their mortality. This is another one of the more interesting plates from the Chant de Maldoror, and this is the one that is believed to be the only one that relates directly to a passage in Lautréamont's text. The passage is the fortuitous encounter on a dissecting table of a sewing machine and an umbrella. The figure here comes out of the painting that he painted the year he started working on the Chant de Maldoror, 1932, where we see this man whose brain is sort of extended, elasticized and extended, being supported by the crutch. Here he's turned into a monster who is devouring a young child but at the same time, there's a woman's hand operating a sewing machine, stitching together the head of the young child. In the foreground are the familiar lamb chop bones, a knife, weapon, again, a weapon of destruction that can be used in both masochistic and sadomasochistic activities. Here, Dali is witness, although he doesn't look like a child here, so it's not 100% sure that that's Dali. And then, of course, the perspective representing the plains of Emporda with the mountains in the distance. And this is another amazingly interesting plate from the Chantement d'Aurore, because he refers to actually 3 different paintings, one being the Angelus and the other 2 being Jean-Louis Ernst Meissonier's The French Campaign from 1814, which shows Napoleon here leading the troops, and another Mouli painting of workers in the field, this one called The Gleaners from 1857. So he's referring here to labor and war. And now we have the Angelus figures, but they've been transformed into these semi-abstract figures where the sack of potatoes has merged with the body of the female peasant, and the wheelbarrow has merged with the body of the male peasant. And if you think of the underlying sexual symbolism in the idea of the potatoes that go into the wheelbarrow, the phallic form and the vaginal form, he's actually reversed the roles, and he's shown the woman as the aggressor and the male as the more passive figure, symbolically using these symbols. And that may have something to do with the fact that his wife, Gala, was more sexually liberated in many respects than he was. She was definitely the more outgoing of the 2. In this headpiece from plate 24, we basically see a lexicon of the various symbols that have been recurring throughout: the lamb chop and the fork. This is a new one we haven't seen yet. It's a pen and an inkwell, the obvious sexual symbolism of the pen dipping into the inkwell. This image also was represented in his painting from the same period, an untitled painting that's been called Desert Landscape, where we see basically a sack of bones that has a phallic image penetrating Dali's nightstand from his bedroom. He repeats that here, but adds to it by putting on top of it his medicine bottle, which seems to be ejaculating. Another symbol that he introduces in this image is the high heel shoe, which it's believed that he was familiar with a 19th century text that associates a female's high heel shoe with masochism, which is one of the themes in the Chantement d'Aurore. So it's basically a nice little dictionary, visual dictionary of some of the various symbols. Now the other imagery here, which we see over here, are basically birds, which in the same way he put the nurse into the earlier image to contrast with all these sexual symbols, the birds represent innocence here. And in plate 25, we see the familiar woman from the Spectre of the Angelus now engaged in self-mutilation, a masochistic act of cutting her breasts and cutting her buttocks, and several familiar symbols, the disembodied innard pierced by a fork, the lamb chops, the dissecting table, and in this case, a glass of water, which maybe was keeping her alive while she's mutilating herself. And here he uses the tree as a vehicle to once again show several of his symbols in a manner that is very similar to one of his sculptures, one of the few sculptures that he did in the early 30s, where the high heel shoe, which represents masochism, is very prominent. We see it here on a section of the tree. Here is the disemboweled innard, the lamb chop, the inkwell, and the pen. And of course, a knife looks like it's cutting into a part of the tree in this case, but it's really hard to tell. And let's see, here's another example where there's a very close relationship between one of the paintings he made that was probably a study for the prince in the Chantement d'Aurore, the dissecting table, the lamb chop here piercing probably a disemboweled innard. This is probably splayed flesh here. Just you know, if you remove the flesh from the body and like you were making, you know, like they do with leather, for example, with animal hides. Another bone over here, and the witness in the distance. And in this example, he introduces one of his favorite images. He throughout his career, he made many paintings and works on paper of the Night of Death, also known as the Horseman. Here's one from 1934 when he was working on the Chant de Maldoror. Here, the Night of Death confronts an image of an adult male with a child clinging to him. Obviously, maybe the child is trying to save the man from his fate of death in this particular image. And then this is a real aberration, kind of an odd image that's quite interesting from the Chant de Maldoror. It's kind of a hallucinatory fantasy scene where he has an image of a Rolls Royce pulling the rocks possibly towards heaven. It appears in a contemporaneous drawing called Omelet About to Be Irreparably Crushed by Hands. But the most important aspect of this is these rocks that appear in the scene. They are based on an area near the plains of Empordà in Cadiz, Spain, called Cap de Cruz, which is where Dali maintained a residence. And so we'll see in various prints of his that these really unique and interesting rocks become part of the imagery. And in this next one, we move from masochism to perhaps sadism, where two of our familiar sexualized women from the Spectre of the Angelus are now wrestling and struggling with one another with all the familiar symbols, but he's added a new one, which appears in the painting here, this sort of soft, the way he did the soft clock, he's made a soft cello, which he refers to as a masochistic instrument. So you see one of the women holding a spoon in the masochistic instrument. In this painting, he's also added a new symbol, which is that of an iron, which is basically ironing the flesh of the lower leg of one of the women. The pose also of the two women wrestling with each other comes out of one of the related paintings of the period, Cannibalism of the Praying Mantis of Lautréamont. So it's clearly a study for this print in the Chant de Maldoror. And finally, the last print we'll look at from the Chant de Maldoror is the tailpiece in plate 42, where we finally see the Night of Death, who seems to be the appropriate image to bring the Chant de Maldoror tale to a conclusion, because after all, everything ends ultimately in death. So, speaking of death, we're going to move on to the Divine Comedy, where Dante writes about his journey in terms of what will happen to him when he dies. And obviously his journey is intended to help him get into heaven. The Divine Comedy consists of 3 sections: the Inferno, which is 9 circles descending into the earth; Purgatory, as I mentioned, a mountain surrounded by 7 terraces; and then finally, the road to heaven, to paradise, is ascending from sphere to sphere, 10 spheres upward until you get to heaven. Hence the title, Salvador Dali's Stairway to Heaven. Okay, right now we're going to talk about Dante's Stairway, and then when we get to the end, I'll explain why I called it Dali's Journey. So to begin, he starts with something very familiar to him and of course to us from the Chant de Maldoror, the plains of Empordà with the mountains in the distance, the deep Renaissance perspective. And it's almost identical, very close in terms of the perspective to his painting Premature Ossification of a Railway Station from 1931. Now, I should mention, Dali worked on the illustrations for the Divine Comedy in the format of watercolor. He made there are 100 prints in all. He made the watercolors over a 9-year period from 1951 to 1960. And remember, 51 is the year that he published the Mystical Manifesto. So it seemed very logical that he would be eager to illustrate the Divine Comedy. I also should mention that he was originally commissioned by the Italian government to illustrate the Divine Comedy to commemorate the 700th anniversary of Dante's birth. However, it became very controversial in the Italian parliament, and for two reasons. One, Dali had described himself as a surrealist who had renounced conventional morality. And secondly, he was Spanish, and the Italian government didn't think a Spaniard should be illustrating the Divine Comedy for this great commemorative event. So Dali persevered, and he found another publisher, and hence we benefit from having this beautiful series of prints. As I mentioned, he basically painted them as watercolors. They were then printed as wood engravings, which means instead of carving into a woodblock print where what stands out in relief is the image, it's the opposite. Just like in a metal plate, you carve into the plate to create the image. So Dali, of course, didn't do the actual carving, but he basically created all the imagery in the watercolor format. So very early on, as they're starting to, getting ready to travel through Inferno, Virgil, the spirit of Virgil, the ancient Roman poet, explains to Dali a little bit about, to Dante, I have this habit of confusing the two, of Dante, what he's going to encounter. And he tells him that there will be three women who will care for him when he eventually gets to heaven. One is the Virgin Mary, another is Saint Lucia, who is the patron saint of Syracuse in Sicily, and the third is Beatrice, the woman who I mentioned earlier, who was an older woman that Dali knew when he was a young child, and he admired her, felt platonic love for her. So, and she will be the one who will guide him into heaven. So to refer to all three women in one, Dali cleverly chose a prototype from the early Renaissance painter Botticelli, and you can see a similar image here, Botticelli's Allegory of Abundance, where we have a very soft outlining, emphasize the sensuous nature of the female form. And then, of course, at the top, we have divine light, since these figures will help him when he reaches heaven, so the reference to divinity. Oh, and this is Dante, by the way, and you can recognize him by this sort of headdress that he wears throughout, and he's usually seen wearing red. As they move deeper into hell, not quite yet in Inferno, they're descending now into limbo before they enter into Inferno, and this is where they encounter the souls of the damned souls of ancient poets and philosophers, including Homer, Ovid, Plato, and Socrates. And as I mentioned earlier, Dali relies a lot on art history for his images. And in this case, the prototype for the figure here, this female figure who is surrounded by all these combating souls, is based on the figure Liberty Leading the People by Delacroix from 1830. However, instead of the flag, we see one of the demons, one of the condemned souls, poking its nose into the mouth of another demon. And remember that image, because we're going to see it in a second elsewhere. And the influence for that image was actually Picasso. The familiar Night of Death appears in the plate where they encounter Cerberus. Cerberus is the three-headed guardian of the third circle of hell, where rain, snow, and hail fall endlessly for an eternity. So he returns to his image, obviously a much beloved image for him, of the Night of Death, but in this case it's not the Night of Death here, I mean it's based on the Night of Death, and he uses the similar pose for Cerberus, the three-headed centaur, and up here we see rain and lightning, referencing to the fact that it always rains and hails and snows endlessly on this centaur. Next, they encounter the greedy and reckless misers and squanderers who are condemned to carry a big weight on their shoulders, as you can see here. Although the prototype is not someone who's been damned, but rather a hero. I'm sure you're all familiar with the figure of Atlas carrying the world on his shoulders from Greek mythology. And this is one of the images Dali might have been familiar with from an archaeological museum in Naples, Italy. Oh, by the way, I should also point out, just as we had Dali and his father as witnesses casting a shadow in some cases, very small in relationship to the large imagery that dominates the composition, we see that same device used to represent the presence of Dante and Virgil throughout the Divine Comedy. Next, they encounter the fallen angels, who are known as choleric people. And the prototype for Dali's rendering here is based on another representation of damned souls, this one being Michelangelo's The Damned from the Last Judgment. You see the very similar contorted poses and musculature that we're familiar with from the Sistine ceiling. Before entering the seventh circle of hell, Virgil informs Dante about the sinners they will encounter in several of the circles that they have yet to descend into. Here, Dali envisions the fallen souls who lie ahead in combat with one another. And this is where I point out that he probably was familiar with Picasso's Figures on a Beach series, where Dali has these two condemned souls, again, sort of being tricksters, fighting with one another, one about to maybe, in this case, bite off the other's nose. This is more of a reference to a French kiss in the hands of Picasso. And now in the representation of the blasphemers who are encountered in the last round of the seventh circle, we find an image that's very familiar to us from the Chant de Maldoror. In this case, though, he's basically merged two of the motifs that we saw there, the dissecting table and the plains of Emperor Da. They become one and the same. And here we have the extended, elongated skull, similar to how he represented the Angelus figures. And you'll notice at this end, it's being supported by the familiar crutch. And at this end, it's a motif we've seen before, draped over the dissecting table. Dali's self-portrait, as we saw in The Persistence of Memory, again, takes on the persona of one of the sinners in The Imposter, who is encountered in the eighth circle, where they find seducers and panderers. In addition to using his self-portrait, he's once again employed the crutch, which is on one hand holding up the nose and the other hand piercing the tongue of the sinner. And bones as well, here using, look like they're being used as weapons to attack the sinner. As I mentioned, his knowledge of art history and recent art history was quite extensive. And in representing a soothsayer, where they encounter soothsayers and sorcerers, the image is very likely modeled after this print by Odilon Rideau, the late 19th century artist, where a serpent visits the Sphinx. And they next encounter demons who sold political favors, who were embattled with one another. Once again, here he returns to the rocks of Cap de Cruz in Cadagua, Spain. Notice this looks like a tongue, a removed tongue just caught between the rocks. And once again, returns to some of the motifs from the Chant de Maldoror and his own paintings in The Torment of Hypocrites, where this image in the background, this image in the background is based on a set design that Dali created in 1941 for a ballet, a Russian ballet that was presented at the Metropolitan Opera in New York City, where he created this monster with a bowed head, his head bowed, and a cracked skull. You see this, and these tall trees behind him, you see this motif in the distance. In the center, we see what looks almost like a skull or a rock, either or, and another rock here, both infested with the ants that we saw in the Accommodations of Desire. And here we see not the images of Dante and Virgil, but their shadows in the foreground. And of course, the familiar plains of Emperor Da with the deep perspective. El Greco becomes the influence in Thieves and Robbers, where we find this headless robber portrayed with a serpent wrapping around it in a style that is very similar to the style of El Greco's painting of the mythological Laocoon, where Laocoon and his sons are being attacked by serpents that wrap around them. And of course, I think the horse seems to be one of Dali's favorite images. And here in the seventh chasm of the eighth circle, Dante and Virgil encounter the spirit of a centaur who was beaten to death by Hercules because he stole Hercules' cattle. But in contrast to most of these other images, this centaur doesn't seem to be shown suffering at all. He seems to be triumphant. So I think here, maybe it was an opportunity to just illustrate the horse in a style that derives from Botticelli, as we saw in the Botticelli female. He shows the triumphant centaur, perhaps when he was still on Earth, feeling triumphant, having stolen Hercules' cattle. The monster from the ballet reappears in The Logician Devil, but here he's swallowing up a figure, and that motif is definitely based on the work of another Spaniard, Francisco Goya's Saturn Devouring His Son from 1819 to 23. Moving back to imagery that stems directly from the Chant de Maldoror, this is the sinner Bertrand de Horn, who was an evil counselor who caused a father and son to become enemies, and he was condemned to pace through hell for eternity with his brain severed from his head. So Dali shows him in a style of the figures from the Chant de Maldoror, with holding his head, which contains, of course, his brain that was severed, and also his arms and his buttocks have been cut into fragments. This is the most violent image in Inferno. And by the way, we find, of course, more of the influence of the Chant de Maldoror in Inferno, because that's where we meet the most despicable souls, the most violent characters. And this is, in fact, a representation of the falsifiers, who were the most despicable of souls, condemned to tremendous suffering. So the familiar motifs, the stake piercing through the head here, the crutch holding up the tongue. But here he introduces a motif that relates more to the paintings that Dali was making in the 50s following the publication of his mystical manifesto, including crucifixion scenes. And so the tension in the hand of the crucified Christ is very similar here in his Divine Comedy print, the tension of the hand with the nail piercing through it, which in this case is pierced to the dissecting table from the Chant de Maldoror. And in this example, where Dante and Virgil encounter counterfeiters, Dali basically uses his own self-portrait shown basically devouring a clone of himself. And when they encounter traitors against their hosts, he, rather than use the crutch to portray a sexual reference, it's used here to portray moral weakness. So those are some of the images. And again, this is obviously not the exact figure as the specter of the Angelus, but the Christ and the extension of the buttock is definitely related, the crutch and the extension of the buttock. So moving now to Purgatory, where they're going to ascend the Seven Terraces. The first image is based on one of Dali's most important paintings, the anthropomorphic cabinet, where the open chest of drawers refers to the depths of the unconscious inside the drawers. He changes the meaning of what's inside the drawers here. Before they enter Purgatory, they meet this fallen angel. And so the empty drawers here refer to the cleansing of the soul, because in Purgatory, basically, those who have left hell have gone to Purgatory. That's where their souls will be cleansed. Once their souls are cleansed, they are then elevated to heaven. So this is the drawers here represent the emptying out of their sins. He returns to a Michelangelo style for Princes of the Flowered Valley. This is before they enter Purgatory, and while sleeping, Dante has a dream that he is abducted by my mistake. This is still before they enter. They encounter Sordello, who lived as a poet in the same time, where in the same location where Virgil once lived. And he describes the path that lies ahead to Mount Purgatory before deciding that he will actually guide them there. And his figural style is modeled on that of Michelangelo from The Last Judgment. But Dali turns to a different style from another old master in his representation of Saint Lucia, who was mentioned earlier as one of the women who will care for him in heaven. While sleeping, Dali has a dream that an eagle is going to lift him up to the entrance to purgatory. But when he wakes up, Virgil informs him instead that it was actually Saint Lucia who took him there. And her very robust, fleshy, voluptuous body is based on the female prototype that we see in the paintings of Peter Paul Rubens from the 17th century. And in this particular image, which is in the 12th canto of Purgatory, Dante and Virgil come across mythological figures who suffered from having too much pride. They have visions of these mythological figures. So to show that, he probably was familiar with Asher B. Duran's Kindred Spirits, a Hudson River School painting that's in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And considering he knew a lot of time, he spent a lot of time in New York, I'm fairly certain this would have been the model for this portrayal, where the two figures stand at the edge of a cliff looking out at a vision. He refers to his own work again in the imagery for depicting the souls of the avaricious and the prodigal in greed and lavishness. Here we see in his painting old age, adolescence, and infancy, a great example of paranoiac critical method, where the opening in the rocks from Catechas for the Cap de Cruz also look like a face. We see that repeated here in this image. And again, I've shown you before the picture of the rocks of Catechus, and here they are. And then in the 6th terrace of Purgatory, they meet the spirit of the poet Statius, who tells Dante that he has been sent to Purgatory for being a spendthrift. So here, the bodily deformations refer to wasteful extravagance rather than to anything sexual. And then one of their last stops in Purgatory is where Dante is purified as he stands before an angel. This is from the final canto. He's first bathed in a river that causes him to remember his good deeds, and thus he's ready to enter heaven. This device of showing the figure with an opening in it so that you can see beyond was also used in his first version of his painting of Gala as the Madonna. And again, it had to do with his ideas about nuclear fission and things dematerializing. So finally, we're going to follow Dante, and now not Virgil, but Beatrice, upward into heaven. And when they first meet, Beatrice looks upwards towards heaven. You see Dali really shows his mastery of watercolor in his depictions of heaven, with representing divine light. And often he also uses the white of the paper to refer to divine light. And the prototype for this particular image was very likely the Baroque artist Bernini's Ecstasy of Saint Teresa. We see the similar rays of divine light and the ecstatic figure with the drapery folds. Now, I mentioned that Dali had this interest in nuclear fission and things dematerializing. He also saw this as things unifying, so they can be coming apart or coming together. In the 1950s, he did some studies such as Raphael's Head Exploding and Corpuscular Madonna, where we see the figures are represented more as they might be seen in terms of atoms and molecules than actual physical reality as we know it. In this instance, the figure is St. Thomas Aquinas, who's telling the stories of St. Francis of Assisi and St. Dominic, and he's bathed in the divine light here. And the light is so bright that it's causing the body to dematerialize. As they ascend further upward from sphere to sphere, Dante has a vision of Christ on the cross. Again, in the 50s, after Dali became a born-again Catholic, he made a number of paintings on crucifixions, one of which is based on this 16th century painting called Saint John of the Cross. And it's believed that, as in this painting, Dali used this triangular figure because in the Renaissance that was considered a divine proportion. And then in this example, the divine presence, Dante comes across the spirit of his great-great-grandfather, who, and he asks him questions about what's going to happen to him. And the great-great-grandfather tells Dante that he's going to have some difficult times. He's going to be exiled from Florence, but eventually he will find salvation, which Dali considers to be the reunification of the universe and as science might explain it, which is why we see the body broken apart here, as we saw in the earlier examples. And in Paradise Language of the Birds, this is where a group of souls forming the emblem of an eagle that speaks to Dante about divine justice and evil rulers is described in the text. And Dali basically changed the narrative in this example because he had made a painting of Gala as Leda from Leda and the Swan. So instead of having a group of eagles lift him higher, Dante is shown here riding on the back of a swan. And in the eighth heaven, Dante and Beatrice encounter the spirits of Christ and the Virgin Mary, whose soul is described by Dante as a rose that descends in the guise of a living star. Once again, Dali changes the narrative, considering he had twice made paintings of Gala as the Madonna. He repeats the poses with her hands in prayer that you see here. And as before, we see his incredible mastery of watercolor and washes in creating an atmosphere of divine light. At the end of the previous canto, Dante is temporarily blinded, but he learns that Beatrice can restore his sight. And as he answers questions from St. John, and this is St. John here, about his love for God, Dante's sight is restored, but the light is still exceedingly blinding. So once again, we find the divine light causing the body to dematerialize, in this case, into conical shapes, which apparently Dali interpreted as a rhinoceros horn and associated with purity. And finally, in the final plate of the Divine Comedy, the prayer of Saint Bernard, Saint Bernard prays to Mary to grant Dante a vision of God and the ability to tell the story of his journey through hell, purgatory, and paradise when he returns to earth. In other words, to write the Divine Comedy. So it ends basically on a very high note. Dante will indeed make it to heaven. So to sum up, there's a direct connection between what was going on in Dali's life and the illustrations that he produced for the Chantamaldoror and the Divine Comedy. During the period of the Chantamaldoror, he was engaging with Gala and the sex orgies. He had fears of female sexuality. He considered himself to be impotent and so on. And he responded to the themes rather than any specific narrative of death, sex, and cannibalism and violence. By contrast, in the Divine Comedy, what really I think we're seeing is not just Dante's journey, and perhaps that's why I unconsciously keep confusing the two. It's because I think Dali really self-identifies here with Dante in traveling to heaven, because after all, if he was identifying with the sinner in the Chantamaldoror, identifying with Dante in the Divine Comedy was Dali's means for personal redemption and salvation. Thank you. So I guess now we'll move on to the, let's see, I want to be able to close the Okay, now oh, stop share. There we go. Okay, I'll turn it over to Kristen.
Hi, David. We have one question ready for you. It's a little bit more on the technical side of this artwork.
Okay.
Do you know who actually finished the Divine Comedy prints for the Italian State Project?
Well, I think I mentioned earlier the publisher, Leclerc, I think is who they are. There's also a book if you want to know more. You may have copies of it because I think we sent them to the various museums. Dali Illustrator, do you have that at the museum? Kristen?
I believe we do, yes.
Because that has the complete documentation on both series in terms of how they were produced, who produced them, the technical process, etc. So I would refer anyone who really wants to know in depth. But the publisher was Leclerc.
Wonderful, thank you. And you talked about it a little bit, but can you elaborate on how you thought about the pairing of these two
Okay, sure.
materials?
Sure. Basically, I work with Carol Sorrell of Carol Sorrell Incorporated. She basically organizes exhibitions for the Park West Foundation, which is based in Southfield, Michigan, and affiliated with the Park West Gallery. But all the exhibitions are sponsored by the Park West Foundation. And Albert Scaglione, who's the owner of the gallery, also has a very distinguished collection. And he owns, as the book that I just mentioned, Dali Illustrator, reproduces 3 series of book illustrations by Dali that are owned by Mr. Scaglione. And when I was approached about doing something with this as an exhibition, they sent me the book, Dali Illustrator, and I looked through it, and I thought that, well, the Sacred Bible, the 3rd series, I didn't think was all that interesting compared to the other 2. And I thought that the other 2 would make such an interesting comparison because, as I pointed out, they represent 2 different periods in Dali's life and work. And it seemed to me there would be such an interesting contrast between the debauchery of the Chantababulor and the kind of sacred nature, religious nature of the Divine Comedy. So it was with that basic, realization that what an interesting juxtaposition the 2 series would make, because they're almost diametrically opposed, yet they were both illustrated by Dali. And then as I set out to research it, I became a lot more familiar with what took place during Dali's life during the periods. And so, every exhibition tells a story. And I think what I first intuited ended up being a really interesting story.
Thank you. We have a couple more questions. One is, could you please repeat how you described the critical paranoiac method?
Yes. Dali would self-induce, I don't know exactly what he did, but he claimed he never used drugs to do it. So he would self-induce what he called a hallucinatory state, which means basically getting into a trance-like state. I know that a lot of the surrealists, particularly the automatists, who did automatic drawing, they would also get themselves into a trance-like state so that they're trying to tap into their unconscious while they're creating. So he was never, he didn't give us a formula for how to do it, but he did say that's what he did. He induced a trance-like state that allowed his imagination to run free. And that's how he would come up with the images.
Fantastic. I have 2 more questions coming in related to the artwork. One is, and forgive me for probably completely mispronouncing this.
That's okay.
Does Teofega appear in Dali's art at all?
Does what appear?
Teofega, Teofagia.
I'm not familiar with the term. What is Teofega?
It appears to be the eating god. Thank you. I was trying to translate that.
Oh, well, I didn't come across it in either of these two series, let's put it that way. So I don't know for sure. I mean, I'm not familiar with every work that Dali ever made, but I would say that's a question that you could easily find out the answer to just by Googling Salvador Dali in the term.
Okay, great. We have one more question related to the art here.
Mhm.
Do you think that Dali attempted to popularize his art forms to a larger community through Catholic imagery?
Through, what was the last part of it?
Catholic
Oh, the
imagery.
Catholic imagery. No, I don't think it had to do with it. I mean, he definitely became a celebrity, but I don't think that his motivation for painting the Catholic imagery had to do with wanting to sell his work. He was already selling his work, so I mean that wasn't an issue. He really did become a born again Catholic, and so the imagery that he painted reflected where his head was at the time.
Thank you so much. I have, so for anyone who still has any questions about the art, we have time for about one more question. As to Lynn, who has asked, will the museum open for in-person visits before the exhibition ends? Or will the exhibit be extended so that patrons can see it in person? I can elaborate on that a little bit. We are currently closed through the end of January for on-site visits. We are looking at possibly being able to extend this exhibition a little bit. I would need to confirm farther with our curator to what date that is. But for the time being, it looks like we will not have this exhibition available to the public for in-person viewing. We do have a couple ways to see it online. I will put a link into the chat box where we have our virtual meditative tours at bigsmuseum.com/virtual-bigs. There you can find a 45-minute meditative tour that gets up close with these artworks, as well as we do offer private virtual tours of the exhibition that can be booked either with the curator, Ryan, or myself, or with a trained docent. And I will also add a link to that has a little bit about prices into the chat box as well. And we have one more question for you. The question is, David, what are you working on now?
Well, I'm what's called semi-retired, but I'm not, I've never stopped working. And I'm doing three things. I've been actually curated additional shows for Carol Sorrell Inc. One that will be, that we just started to pitch to museums. I don't know if the Biggs has looked at it yet, but it's an exhibition on Marcel Mouli, who was the last of the school of Paris painters. He lived into the early 21st century, and he was influenced by Picasso and Matisse, but actually found his own self through his landscapes. I think I called the exhibition Paradise on Earth because his landscapes really are quite paradisiacal. And then I'm doing some other projects for them as well. Another one is on the late Israeli artist Itzhak Tarkai. So I'm continuing to do curatorial projects working with Carol, who's terrific to work with, I might add. And then I also am a writer, and I write for an online art journal called Visual Art Source, visualartsource.com. If you'd like to receive their weekly newsletter, if you're curious what I'm writing about, I appear periodically in there. I actually just published in the newsletter on Saturday my latest piece, although it won't be on the website maybe for a week or two, but it will get up there. It's basically a piece about artists who impersonated Superman in the process of making their art, and also one artist who impersonated Jacqueline Onassis Kennedy. And most of the works had to do with social activism the work that inspired me to write it was actually an artist from San Antonio, David Alcantar, who first in San Antonio, starting with early voting day and working all the way through the election day, ran 3 miles a day through San Antonio neighborhoods dressed as Superman and carrying a big flag that said vote, exclamation point. And then he took it to Georgia and for 3 days ran through Georgia neighborhoods, again, with his get out the vote performance. So it's an interesting performance art piece that caught my eye. So I'm continuing to do that. And then the other thing that I do is my own artwork. I actually was influenced by the Surrealists because I practice what's called automatic drawing, and I've been doing it for several years. And if you're interested in seeing my artwork, just go to Instagram, David S. Rubin Art on Instagram. And one of the things I do is every day I make a little drawing in a little sketchbook of today's date. I haven't done one today because I was preparing for this, but it will take place once I log off. And then I take photographs of the date drawings, and the photographs are artworks in their own right as well. I also do large drawings and in my most recent work, they've evolved into some themes. Two of the themes are somewhat biblical. One is called the Tree of Life. The other is called the Crown. But more recently, I've been doing these, they're sort of semi-abstract images, and I draw what almost look like Mardi Gras beats, but abstracted in various configurations. And I lived and worked in New Orleans when I was the curator at the Contemporary Arts Center there, and was influenced by my experiences there. So my drawings, my date drawings, and my photographs can all be seen at David S. Rubin Art on Instagram. So I do a lot of things.